While they're setting up the chairs, I'm actually just going to take a moment to set up the conversation we're about to have and who you'll be hearing from, and just show you an image that I think all of you will hopefully recognize. This is an image that really became iconic during the wars, the war that was recently launched. It's not showing yet, is it? It'll be a minute. Okay, no problem. So before that, let me just introduce those of the speakers, these newsroom leaders who I think have been so strong in this industry in shaping much of the journalism that we see and having the really hard, okay, all right. Sorry about this. So I want to start this town hall meeting with an image I think all of you will recognize. This is a photo of Olena Kurylo taken by Wolfgang Schwan shortly after the aftermath of a Russian bombing on her home, just as the invasion of Ukraine had started. This face, what happened to her, the pain and what she said really woke up the world. Olena is a teacher and she wrote, "We wrote poems about the war. We studied the history, but we never thought that this would happen on our land." And if you go to the next image in the slideshow, you can see how very quickly this image began to circulate. It was on almost every major newspaper in Europe the next day. She became an iconic image, and the story of what happened to her really started to tell the real brunt in real time of the civilian toll that this war, this very emerging war, was taking. And as somebody who covers conflict and civilian costs, it was really incredible to see how much her story resonated with people. But just as quickly as her story began to resonate, if we go to the next image, it was immediately, there were many who went online in an attempt to discredit her. People who claimed that she was a spy, a plant from the Ukrainian government, people who claimed that the photo was years old and being repurposed, that this was what people might call fake news, but for the purposes of our conversation and what we'll be talking about today, we talk about as disinformation, this intentional effort to mislead, right? And what happened here, this kind of attempt at disinformation isn't new, but it's different than how it used to be because of changing technologies, platforms that have emerged, different means of circulating information really quickly, and just as quickly as it appears, it can disappear and be replaced. And even though there may be an attempt to correct it. So for example, if we can just move on, the last slide in the slideshow would be great to just show right now that video. This video is how Olena responded, essentially to this effort to discredit her. And if you hear her words, if she tells you I'm real, if she comes forward to say all of this, I think we're not hearing it, but you can see the captions, and she's essentially coming forward to say all of this, to contest those attempts at disinformation. But how many people do you think this video reached? How many of the communities on WhatsApp that are sharing this kind of attempt to discredit her and her story and this reporting that exist in different languages in different places, may this never have reached, right? Because that damage was already done. Disinformation isn't new, but technologies have dramatically altered and rapidly changed how it can damage journalism and the public. So what should news organizations do? What should online platforms do? And what happens when the campaign isn't about the subject of a story, but the journalists behind it? What mental toll can that take on those journalists? And what should newsrooms be doing to protect them? These are just some of the questions that many of the newsroom leaders who are at the forefront of our industry will be answering today. So I want to briefly introduce you to each of them. First, we have Zaffar Abbas. Zaffar Abbas is the editor of Dawn, Pakistan's oldest and most prestigious English language newspaper. I grew up reading Dawn, and just I can't tell you the amount of public service it has done in that country. Sally Buzbee, the executive editor of the Washington Post. Musikilu Mojeed, the editor-in-chief and the chief operating officer at Nigeria's Premium Times, which he also co-founded. Olga Rudenko, the chief editor of Ukraine's Kyiv Independent, which launched in late November of last year by the former editorial team of the Kyiv Post. And Michael Slackman, the assistant managing editor for International at the New York Times. Welcome to the stage. Please let's welcome everybody. Thank you. So we're really lucky to be able to have this conversation with everyone who's up here right now. These are extraordinarily, incredibly important editors who are making key decisions. They represent different countries across the world: Nigeria, Pakistan, Ukraine, of course, the United States. But in the conversations I've had with them before they all came today, all of them have been really candid in wanting to talk about many of the attempts at disinformation that they've experienced at their papers, what they've done with their journalists. And I want to begin with the issue that I think came up most frequently with each of you, and that what seems to be a continuous struggle for organizations as they attempt to figure out what to do when there is an attempt to discredit individual journalists. And Musikilu, because you're sitting next to me, and I know you've experienced this firsthand with a journalist who is writing a story about trafficking. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened and the effect that it had for you?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It was a very sad one for us. This journalist had risked her life. She went undercover in an attempt to expose the human trafficking ring in Nigeria. So we partnered with a newspaper in the Netherlands, and she went across the border. She moved in with the traffickers, and eventually she was able to escape close to Benin Republic. But after the story was published, we were shocked that there was intense disinformation about the journalist, that she made up the story. And it was so intense on social media that the journalist broke down completely and became a mental case. It was so serious that we had to bring her here to the United States for treatment. Till this day, that journalist is still struggling. More than 5 years after, that journalist is still struggling to recover. What we did at the time was, first of all, we blocked her away from social media because a lot of the disinformation took place on social media. She was called names. They said she made up the story, even though we offered to open up our records to people who could come to our newspaper and see the record and see that and talk to our partners in the Netherlands.
You mean open it up to show that these are facts?
These are facts.
Wow, who did you open it up to?
We offered to as many people as possible. We sent records to so many people who asked for evidence of the investigation. But because what the reporter uncovered was so shocking, and perhaps there were a lot of vested interest. As you know, the human trafficking ring is a huge industry. So there was intense disinformation. And that has kind of damaged that reporter. She's today unable to practice effectively, and she's just on the brink.
It's really difficult to have these kinds of conversations, particularly when we think about disinformation campaigns and we think about online trolling, we think about the attempts to physically threaten somebody, but the kind of mental toll that that can take is often very ignored. And I think news organizations are starting to see how a rapid mobilization online can have devastating impacts on a reporter, on their work, on their futures. And I know that many others of you have also dealt with this. And so I'm going to actually ask Sally if you can talk a little bit about what you've experienced when one of your journalists has come under attack like this, and what you've had to think through, the thought process, the checklist, and considering, do we respond? And if so, what do we do?
Yeah, I want to start by saying, obviously, that I have the greatest respect, obviously, for people who work in countries that don't have press freedom, where many of these issues are much more intense. But it is, I think, quite surprising and shocking how intense attacks on journalists has also become in the United States. I mean, it's so routine that when we were sort of talking about this panel beforehand, I was literally trying to figure out which of the, tens of things, which example I should bring forward as the most instructive, because it happens so very often, right? And so I would say a few things. I would say there's two things in particular that I think are perhaps not getting enough attention. They're very difficult issues to deal with. I can't pretend that I know what the solutions are, but these are the thought processes we go through. One is that increasingly when we reach out for fair comment on a story, that is not treated seriously. You can't get actually a real answer, and people won't engage with us. And that's sort of a form of attack, because then we're sort of criticized, credible journalist organizations are criticized for not having that, right? And that has become, I think, actually a relatively difficult issue that we really haven't found a solution for. It's totally fine. It's still our responsibility to do that, but increasingly it is making reporting more difficult, and fair reporting more difficult. And so that's one thing that I would love to see, some thinking about and some engagement on. The other is just when we write about very tough situations, there is increasingly really virulent trolling, doxing, every possible thing that you can think of. And it has gotten to a level, we had a situation recently, a reporter who happens to be based in the Midwest and worked on a story with several other journalists about an online provocateur who was attacking people. And the story was published. There were 3 bylines on it. 2 were men, 1 was a woman. The woman immediately came under, this is an American woman journalist. She happens to be a journalist of color. Immediately came under attack online. Every single online account, social media that she had was hacked in an incredibly vicious way. There were actually photos that were doctored that made it seem that she had abhorrent and racist points of view. And this all happened in a flash. She was a sophisticated reporter. Her online accounts were pretty locked down. It wasn't like, a newbie, right? But it was an amazingly sophisticated attack. She also then immediately received a series of what were clearly orchestrated death threats, other threats. Her home address, of course, was put online, the whole shebang. So we were able, of course, we have resources. We're lucky we protected her physically. It was enormously difficult to protect her online. I mean, you can go to a credible platform and you can get them to take stuff down. But when it is being organized on platforms that are not friendly to, many news organizations, we just played whack-a-mole with this thing for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I will also say that I think that, there's very little legal steps you can take. I mean, this was a orchestrated online conspiracy to kind of pull down a journalist, and there was very little.
Were you able to figure out who was orchestrating this, or even to trace its roots? Because I know things disappear quickly.
Yeah.
People are good at.
I mean, in this case, we could, but we couldn't. You can't figure out where to stop it, where it's happening and all the players and things like that. I mean, we knew sort of who was behind it. So, what do? You go to ground, okay, but go to ground and protect yourself and hunker down. I mean, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking this suppresses journalism, right? These tactics suppress journalism because I don't know how, this is a very courageous journalist. She's out there reporting, but it has to have an impact on the kinds of stories that you do. And so I think those are the things that go through my mind.
So when a news organization is dealing with this, thinking through, do we have legal options? Can we go to these platforms? When it comes to the mental health of the reporter, what are some of the things that the news organization is also thinking about?
Right. I think that is an amazing, amazing question, because it's very important. I mean, no matter how prepared you are for this, what I have found as an editor is that it is always shocking when it happens. I mean, we talk about this in our newsroom constantly. We train against it. We give security training. We give prep training. We do this and it is still shocking when it happens to you and devastating. This particular person, stayed in her apartment for 3 weeks. And I think is still quite shell-shocked by the experience. We had something that happened last weekend, and the person was legitimately shocked. I had no idea this was happening to us, right? And I think every single time it happens, it's shocking. So there's also a lot of frustration on the part of journalists, like, why can't you do more to protect me from this? I get that a lot. And I'm actually really open to conversation within the industry about, are we using best practices? Are we doing enough? What can we do? We don't really want to go to law enforcement. We're independent journalists. That's not our instinct, right? And there aren't really great laws around this, to be frank, okay? Because people are very clever. I mean, we had somebody come up to somebody in a public space within the last 3 months and do this, right? Right to his face, right? He saw the press pass, knew who he worked for, never got close enough for assault, but was just doing right like that, okay? And law enforcement is just it's a public protest. Didn't touch you. What's your thing? So, so I think in a situation like that, we offer mental health counseling. We're trying to be responsive. This particular person felt very helpless and felt I wish there was more response we could do. And so there was a level of frustration on the part of the journalist that I totally understood, and I'm sure has a long-term, effect.
I think it's hard to track. It's new, it's nascent. News organizations are still figuring out who do we know at XYZ platform? What are our legal options if they're in X state or whatever it might be? Michael, can you talk a little bit about your experience at the Times? And, I know reporters there who've suffered incredible harassment campaigns. And in some cases, the Times has even responded publicly. What is the thinking that goes into deliberating? Should we respond, and how should we respond?
Well, first of all, I really want to say it's an honor to be sitting up here with such distinguished journalists, especially you, Azmat, who through your journalism has shown really how to push back and disprove not only misinformation by bad actors, but by governments. And, I think I think your work with students, bringing them along, training the next generation of journalists, and the awards that you have won really represent, I think, the spearhead of what we all need to do, really good reporting. At the end of the day, it comes down to the reporting. And what you're talking about undermines that reporting. There are flashpoint issues in our society right now: abortion, guns, specifically issues around identity. And we want our reporters to feel confident and brave enough to dig into those, really interrogate them from every side and every angle. And unfortunately, what happens when they do that with the utmost professionalism, they're attacked from the left and from the right. And what's a big concern at the Times, as I'm sure at other institutions, is journalists who are now shrinking away for taking on and interrogating those issues that are really essential points of interrogation for society today. We have had reporters who, in a more traditional sense, cover stories. Somebody doesn't like the story and they will troll them and dox them. There's one case that Azmat had asked me about, and a woman reporter on our staff and her mother, who lives in the other side of the country, were terribly harassed, threatened. And when it's women, that people feel free to say things like, "I'm going to rape you." Really, really terrifying, horrible things. The question for us in terms of responding is, I think we have to ask ourselves 3 things. First of all, what's the impact of what's happening, right? To what extent is it actually resonating? If some jerk on Twitter says, "I'm going to come after you," and he's got 40 followers, I say hit the mute button. if it actually becomes, widespread, if it's Donald Trump who is attacking Maggie Haberman, and he's now amplified it on his 1 million+ follower Twitter account, that probably is going to need some kind of response. What's the source? What's the source of the attack? That's another thing that we have to assess when we're looking at whether or not to respond and how to respond. What's the reach of the source and the impact? How far has it gone? I was talking to Kevin Roos, one of our disinformation reporters, and he said, if people are promoting the idea that Bigfoot exists, we don't necessarily have to respond because it's not such a big deal. If somebody is attacking a reporter for honest and fair reporting, we're going to have to respond. I don't really know how to respond. I really don't. There's two schools of thought. Ignore it, don't give it oxygen, and it will go away. I kind of lean towards that side because of my own personal experiences in trying to respond. And the other is way on the other side, which is fight back. Just get in the mud pool that is, or the cesspool that is Twitter, and really give it to them back. I don't think that particularly works either. So I'd love to hear, if somebody has a brilliant idea on how to respond to these online attacks.
Well, thanks for drawing out that example. When you brought up a good point when he raises that women will often experience certain kind of abuses, that people of color, people from vulnerable or marginalized groups often face a brunt of that. And when it is so expansive, when it is coming from so many places, and when the source is not one, but countless, right? To what extent do you have the ability to really even sit down and dig into these? And at that point, when an institution is thinking about this, and I think, Olga, I would love for you to maybe jump in here, because I think a lot about what Ukrainian journalists have been experiencing is probably on another level at this point in technology, at this point in states that have for years been training to do this exact kind of disinformation and unleashing it at their maximum potential possible. Ukrainian journalists are particularly vulnerable. What have you seen, and what do you think about when you're trying to consider how to respond to something that large and that big?
Thank you. I just want to take 30 seconds in the beginning to comment on something that was said before. Incredible tribute to Mikhail Gorbachev that was given by Dmitry Muratov. I was listening to it, sitting there thinking I must have prepared some cool visuals myself. Unfortunately, I have not been friends with any leaders of authoritarian countries. I also feel compelled to add, for the understanding of the context, that Mr. Gorbachev, apart from loving his wife more than his work, also supported the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, which was the start of Russia's war against Ukraine. He supported it. I think this fact is also important to be remembered. Thank you. Thank you.
Journalists provide context. Absolutely.
Just combating disinformation. Yes, thank you for the, sorry. Yes, it is. We in Ukraine are in a very strange time. It is a very strange time to be a journalist. Not just, when people ask us about what it's like to do journalism in Ukraine, in the country, when it is your country that is being invaded in this war in your country, and you're a citizen as well as a reporter, people mostly think about the physical danger, frontline reporting, things like just the risk of being killed by a missile. Last night, two of my journalists were on a reporting trip in Kharkiv, and a missile hit a building right next to them as they were asleep. There was no air raid siren in action, so they were not in shelter. So it's things like that, but also it's a very dangerous time in the meaning of just rethinking the core values of the profession, being a citizen versus being a journalist. Things like, I know that many journalists in Ukraine are now going through a difficult process of self-reflection and facing temptation sometimes to do some self-censorship, with things like when they learn that something or some potential misconduct that is on the Ukrainian side, And that's where some, my colleagues before mentioned online bullying. That's where online bullying steps in for Ukrainian journalists, because we published recently an investigative piece about misconduct in one specific division of the Ukrainian army that is overseen by Ukraine's intelligence. And when you do that, the journalist faces incredible pushback on social media, mostly for daring to do that, because the most popular thing is being called a traitor, and it hurts a lot to be called a traitor when your country is being attacked. But we firmly believe that shedding light on any misconduct in the long term, it is helping your country. It's never hurting your country. I wasn't planning to tell that story, but I will. On a little more personal note, I faced some, I guess the right word to say would be bullying for something that I published before the war, several days before. Unlucky timing on my part, I published a critical op-ed in the New York Times about Mr. Zelensky, assessing his presidency up until February 2022. That was before the invasion. Of course, after the full-scale war started and the world discovered Mr. Zelensky, and he rose to the challenge as being a war leader, and we applaud him for that. That op-ed was still fresh. And I started getting a ton of hate mail from people who have just discovered Mr. Zelensky, and who were telling me, a Ukrainian journalist who was in Ukraine with missiles hitting my country and my hometown, they were telling me that I'm a traitor and I should be sent to dig trenches, and that I'm on the Kremlin payroll, and so on and so on. And there would be emails signed with like something Massachusetts, and and it's surreal. I had a separate folder in my mailbox for that. But that's of course nothing compared to things that many Ukrainian journalists have faced. Actually, one of my colleagues is here, Sevgil Musayeva, who's the chief editor of Ukrainska Pravda, a very prominent Ukrainian news outlet. And hopefully Sevgil will tell you during her speech tomorrow, right? I know you're planning to, but I'm kind of, they did a very important story a couple months ago about misconduct in the office of a top official who was reporting in mass cases of Russian soldiers raping Ukrainians. As it turned out, there was a lot of intentional or not intentional disinformation, misinformation in those reports. And running a story like that, shedding light on this misconduct, I'm sure it took a lot. And there was incredible pushback, astonishing pushback that both Sevgil and her reporter faced online for that. So she has a sad but very powerful example of how to deal with that.
But thank you for illuminating that kind of complexity, especially when things are so drawn out to be black and white. I think it can be incredibly difficult for people to want to take in more of that complexity, and also highlighting the role that it creates in sort of censoring journalists and what they wind up choosing to do because of the effect that it's having. And that kind of brings me to you, Zaffar, because of censorship in Pakistan is coming from so many places. It's coming from civilian government, it's coming from the military, it's coming from other actors who might be there online. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences at Dawn News in navigating that, and some of the writers that have had to face that firsthand?
Just picking up from what my Ukrainian colleague said about being called a traitor or unpatriotic. Well, in my country, credible journalists are described as traitors or unpatriotic on a daily basis. And a stage has come where we think it as a badge of honor. And we joke among ourselves that how come you have not been branded as traitor or unpatriotic? You must be doing something bad, journalism, things like that. And this is the state of journalism in Pakistan. Yes, we have seen censorship. We have fought against censorship various levels over a period of time. And we have won our freedom, we have lost our freedom, and we continue to do that. It's an ongoing battle for a very, very long time, and it's going to continue. What has happened now is that, yes, disinformation was there over a period of time, misinformation, propaganda journalism, propaganda from governments during the Cold War, after the Cold War. But the way this term fake news has been politicized, starting from White House over here by President Trump and trickling down to countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, and so many other places. It is now being used by rulers, autocratic rulers, by politicians to discredit credible journalism in a very organized manner. It's not about just some individuals that we are dealing with. It's an organized campaign to dub credible journalism as fake news. And this is what we feel is problematic. You talked about Dawn being attacked in various ways. Yes, we have been attacked by people in the past, by corrupt mafias, by politicians, by criminals and all those things. But now, in a very organized way, in the last 4 or 5 years, the way Dawn has been targeted by trolls created by rulers, by members of the security establishment, members of the intelligence community, just to try and discredit journalism or journalists who have been campaigning for freedom to speak the truth. And to be very honest, it hurts and it damages credibility because it creates doubts in the mind of people that they must be doing something wrong. And that is why hundreds of thousands of people on social media are attacking this kind of journalism. And for us, how to deal with it or how to react to it, as my colleague from the New York Times said, we don't know. We were not trained to deal with this kind of situation. I come from the so-called legacy media. I've been in journalism for over 40 years now, but I never faced this kind of situation and how to deal with it. When my colleagues were being attacked on social media, starting from one of my best writers, Cyril Almeida, down to so many others, it was very difficult for us to handle this kind of situation, other than that, just continue to do good journalism. Just continue to say what you believe in, what you think is right. But probably it's not helping enough. We have not been able to find a solution. And now a stage has come where particularly women journalists are being targeted on social media. And they are being targeted with all kinds of foul language, which for us, we have absolutely no way how to counter this kind of campaign. We know journalists who have left this profession because of family pressure, pressure from the society. Their movements have been restricted. There's some who are fighting back, but only up to a point. So I really don't know how to answer your question, but yes, it is a very difficult situation we are faced with, because it's not about individuals who are attacking us. It's a very organized campaign to turn good and credible journalism into fake news and to live with it. So we'll continue to do what we believe in, but I don't know whether we are winning.
I really want to hone in on that, like how much has rapidly changed in recent years and how even some of the most advanced news organizations and most veteran journalists are struggling with thinking about how to respond. And I just want to share a quick anecdote. Like, a friend called me last year. She was the subject of something. She was asking me to help her look into who was behind it. Maybe she could write a story. I thought, I'll use my investigative tools. We'll dig into this. It was far too complex and deep. And it got to a point where it just seemed like, what could possibly come of my doing this or of her doing this? Like at this point, the best thing she can do is take care of herself. We can maybe in the future, there's a chance to turn this into journalism, to write a story about it, to think about it. But I just want to focus with everybody, whoever would like to respond to this, but what do you think would be the most helpful thing? Is it more conversations about how this materializes? Is it more security teams talking about it? Is it more conversations with platforms and more engagement with them, or maybe the off-color, non-traditional platforms that we don't usually have those connections with? What do you think it would take to maybe move the needle on this, or to start to share some of the ways forward?
Yeah, you mentioned platforms, and I think that this is really an area to focus. In the past 10 years, we've been talking a lot about the relationship of traditional media and platforms like Facebook and Twitter, but we're mostly focusing on things like how they destroyed our business model. And I think from my experience, the level of their understanding of the seriousness of the problem, of their role in spreading disinformation is not sufficient. And I've had conversations on sidelines of various events with big tech people, and that's where I have that understanding that they kind of politely listen to you when you talk about how the algorithms should be changed to maybe amplify messages from verified media. And not just amplify whatever is getting more engagement, whatever is getting more traction. And they politely listen to you, they nod, and then they offer you a free training on using Facebook, which is not helping real story. Yes, I think the core of the problem is that the way that platforms work is they have equal footing for everyone. So like we 20-something people news organization that is a local news organization in Ukraine on the ground. When we publish something on Twitter, Facebook, any other platform, when we are picked up by Google search, we get the same treatment. Basically, we are competing against against propaganda outlets, against the bad guys who always have more money and more resources to throw into that, and they will always be winning. Playing against the algorithms because they will always have more resources. And until it's not recognized by the platforms, until they don't, until they review their relationship with the media, it will still be the case where more money buys you more eyeballs on the platforms, and it's not the good guys who have more money.
Yeah. I think there has to be an holistic approach to this. There can be no definite answer to this problem because now, as my colleague from Pakistan said, it's much more organized than ever before. In my country, I know that politicians have their trolls, whether at the national and state levels. They have people they call social media influencers that work for them. And what is their job? Basically, is to discredit good media, discredit reporting, and attack critical journalists. That's basically their job. But what we haven't done very well is that we hardly focus our reporting on those kind of tendencies, which I think we all must focus. We must commit more resources to reporting about this kind of misinformation, disinformation campaigns that are going on, that are organized. We must investigate and expose them as much as possible. That's in addition to, because I also like to underline the point made by my colleague from the New York Times about accurate reporting. That's most important because these guys are laying ambush and they want to find 5% error in your story, and then they latch on it and discredit your reporting. So one solution is for us to try as much as possible to get our reporting right and do whatever we can to ensure that, because he was talking about responding. The episode that I narrated earlier, the more we responded, the wider the misinformation grew at the time. So it meant that you really have to apply the kind of metric that he tried to see what was the implication. Where is the disinformation coming from? If it is somebody who is not that influential, you let it go. If it's somebody with 1 million followers, then either you engage him, share the truth with him, you assume that he doesn't know the truth or something like that. I think we must adopt different kind of measures.
No,
Michael, go ahead.
Sure, thank you, excuse me. I feel like I kind of have to correct myself. I wish it were as simple as getting it right. I wish it were as simple as really nailing the facts. The problem now is we don't agree what facts are. We don't agree what truth is. Everything is whatever you want it to be. We live in a world, right, where the best ratings and the most read articles tend to be opinion pieces that validate your preconceived ideas about things that make you feel good. Online, we're never going to tame online. That's too late. Online is available, and you block Donald Trump from Twitter and he goes to what's the new thing that he's on, right? I mean, I think, and this is naive and perhaps unattainable, but it's about education. I think every school kid needs to be schooled in media literacy. Everybody needs to be taught to ask who is actually the source. I also think we also need to remind people what citizenship is, at least in this country, right? It's not just about rights, it's about responsibilities. It's about caring for other people. So I'm sorry, I wish it was as simple as reporters really doing their work, but until we get past this post-truth era, we're all going to be puzzling over how to respond.
Sally.
So I would say just a couple of things. I do think there are a couple practical things that we can do, although I largely agree with what Michael just said. But I do think there are some practical things to your question. I think, first of all, just the sharing of best practices among news organizations. And I do find that sometimes there is some reluctance to do that because these are really kind of, ugly, painful things and you can't do very much. And so one of the things that I have been doing is like, okay, it's clear that women get attacked more. Like, who's figured this out? Like, what are the best practices? Who can, the International Women's Media Foundation has some good stuff. I mean, there's some stuff out there, and I think like sharing, like what worked, what didn't work. I also agree totally that there's a real divide right now between like, do we just, stick by our journalism and let things slough off, go to ground? And there is actually kind of a new generation of journalists who are attacking back very aggressively. And so even within our news organizations, there's a wide variety of response of the best way to handle these things, right? I mean, it's actually literally disagreement in our newsrooms about how to handle this. I do think that I'm just going to say, I think both answers are critical. We do have to just be our very best selves and not let people provoke us, because I do actually think that that's a risk right now. But I also think that we have to, I completely agree. Like, I have begun to think that fact checking is not really what we're after. What we're after is reporting on how disinformation spreads, right? That is really, to me, the story of our generation. I'm actually more interested in the networks, like how do hate attacks happen? How do organized hate attacks happen? How do organized disinformation? I mean, that is what I think is actually the critical issue in our world right now, and where we should put our reporting. I mean, there still is value. Let me give two examples. When we did the January 6th thing, we put the audio tapes embedded in the story of the actual threats, the actual voicemail threats that election officials were getting, okay? We didn't just write about them. We literally took the voicemails they had gotten on their cell phones and showed what they were getting, okay? And that had astonishing power with, like, people would call to us and say, oh my God, I couldn't believe that this poor person in Arizona was getting these death threats, right? So look, we shouldn't underplay the power of actually powerfully and accurately telling these stories about hate attacks, because they do open people's eyes. We have a story today about a Democratic Congresswoman and just the struggle she has had to fight against actual organized violence against her. And that story, I think, is actually stronger in some ways than, I totally agree. I wish the platforms would pay more attention, But I think that we just have to kind of show what is actually happening, where this battle is being fought. And sometimes we have to do that in terms of attacks on journalists, but the attacks on journalists generally are following the same pattern as some of the political attacks. And I think there is some power to just show, like literally dive in and report in an intricate and transparent fashion, how these attacks are happening. I think there's some power to that. The only other thing I will say is that I do actually think that look, if you go down the rabbit hole of responding and attacking back, it almost never ends well. It spreads the misinformation more. But I do actually think that you have to be pretty fast in terms of at least sort of defending yourself, putting out a factual version of events, because I actually think that especially younger audiences, if you don't respond, they expect you to respond, right? So I do actually think that news organizations have to not fight. I don't think that ever works, but plainly state as transparently as they can exactly what happened. I have found that there is some small amount of efficacy in doing that, I would say.
Ultimately, I partly agree with her. My problem is that if we go into the business of responding to all these campaigns, I don't know when are we going to do what is our real job is, to do good journalism. And that remains a challenge with all media organizations, with most journalists. You see, what's happening is we gather at IPI's forums every 6 months, every year, talk about how many journalists have been killed in this year over a period of time, about the culture of impunity that goes on, and we continue to campaign against that. There's a CPJ platform that constantly talks about this, and so many other organizations. It's a great thing that is happening. But another danger that is happening to journalism is with these kind of campaigns to discredit journalism. Actually, a sustained campaign is going on to destroy credible journalism, to kill journalism. So it's not just about killing journalists. Now the whole campaign is to destroy credible journalism. And unless some collective thinking goes into it to try and counter this, even first to understand it, what the hell is going on, the way it is being attacked and targeted and discredited, and how to deal with it, I think very soon people are going to move away from what we have been doing over a period of time, that is credible journalism.
So this is a very tough conversation to have, because it's so hard to determine what a right response is. You can look at case studies and have different kinds of ideas about what one should do, but one sort of emerging reporting tool that we've seen being used are the development of not just teams of reporters who excel at open source intelligence techniques, analyzing, for example, satellite imagery after, for example, Russia says, no, we did not commit these crimes in Bucha. Those images are doctored, and showing, like the Times did, here are satellite imagery showing, here's how we were able to verify that these images are real. These teams of, the Washington Post has a visual forensics team, and a lot of journalists who aren't even necessarily on these teams are starting to learn those tools, incorporating them into work. They're showing their work as they do it when they publish, and then they're able to respond more easily when they have that laid out. Can you talk a little bit about the role that can play, and also maybe even the extent of it as technology continues to advance, and you can investigate metadata, but now you can also fabricate metadata?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, you are a pioneer in this field. And so we should honor the work you have done, which I think has inspired many of us. Look, I think that open source, we call it visual forensics, as we do, whatever you call it. I think this is absolutely the future. It has enormous power. It has limited power because it is very intensive work. It is very resource heavy work. And the reality of the situation is, the journalism schools, please teach this as quickly as possible. Okay. Because our visual forensics team, I'm constantly torn between having them do their own work and having them train the rest of the newsroom. Okay. That's, literally, we just more, because it is,
we're on it. We have a whole OSINT clinic.
I know
coming.
you are, and it's great. I mean, because these are very specialized skills and you have to knit people together in ways. And even some of our best investigative reporters will sit with these folks and just absorb, what you can actually do. It is transformative. It also is expensive, intensive, resource heavy. You have to pick your battles. We have a team of 6 people and it was literally a one-track team. And you're like, I have 9 other things I want you to work on. And I have 6 people who can do this work. I mean, that is literally what's happening in our newsroom right now. Okay. And so what I would say, I also think that it obviously has power, whether you look at the recent, issue of the killing of a Palestinian journalist, whether you look at Buka, whether you look at Roy Moore back in the day, which to me was one of the very first, when the Post basically said this person is trying to scam us, that to me was
And you filmed him back. Was that what
exactly
happened? It
right.
was so
Like a
great.
transformative moment in, maybe you don't think of that as visual forensics investigation, but it was literally piecing it together from open source information about who that person was. And so I do actually think this is transformative journalism. And but it is, I think we have to be honest with ourselves, like just how hard it is. I mean, it's very, very complex and revelatory journalism. Buka was super interesting because, first of all, the Russians are saying these things didn't happen. There's also attacks on journalists who are saying it's happened. Firsthand information, eyewitness reporting is being questioned, which is kind of mind-blowing, right? And so you take the satellite images, you say, this is what the ground looked like. This is what the cars looked like. Here's the Russian tanks. Then 2 days later, here's what the cars look like. Here's the bodies, okay? The thing that's so interesting about that is that it clicks into people who we don't think of as normal journalism consumers. It clicks into wonks. It clicks into, 32-year-old guys, right? I mean, like you get readers, viewers, readers, whatever you want to call it, for that kind of journalism that you sometimes don't get for an eyewitness narratively written account. And that is super interesting to me. So.
Yeah, Olga, I saw you.
Just wanted to jump in on that. Yes, the case of Bucha is, of course, the horrible example, but also a very strong example of disinformation being spread. But I just wanted to say that as somebody who is in the same information space where a lot of this disinformation is being spread, because I'm Ukrainian, but my first language is Russian, so I'm also exposed to the Russian, let's say, domestic disinformation efforts. As powerful as open source investigations are, and of course I've followed all the satellite investigations about Bucha, and they're very important. As powerful as they are, I think we need to be realistic about penetrating the bubbles, because I just don't, maybe I'm pessimistic, but I just don't see a person who believes because they heard somewhere that Bucha was staged. I just don't see them coming across a New York Times investigation that's it's like a long piece with satellite images, and choosing between, should I read this piece that's going to take me 15 minutes and prove me wrong, or should I watch Netflix? They will always choose to watch Netflix, and it's a matter of and I don't have, I'm not saying that I have an answer to that. If I had, I wouldn't be speaking. I would be somewhere implementing it, because it's curing disinformation is like curing cancer in terms of both importance and complexity. We are running against the human nature, which is, it is very natural for people to want to be in on a secret, to want to know what is actually happening, what is, what the system is not telling you. And I just, my gut feeling is, as I completely agree that we need to be our best selves. That's very well put. But my gut feeling is that the answer to that probably lies in how information is distributed and spread, and maybe also in the realm of what was mentioned about citizenship and media literacy.
Thank you. There's no question that visual investigations is an extraordinarily powerful new tool that has brought in new audiences, pushed back against misinformation and disinformation. But I have to sadly agree with Olga. I mean, all it takes is somebody who you're accustomed to because you agree with them on Fox News or MSNBC or whatever your news outlet of choice is, say it's not true. You know, how many people in Russia have we heard of talking to relatives in Kyiv who are being bombed and they're saying, no, I don't believe you, you're lying. You know, how do you overcome that? I do want to add, though, that I agree completely with what Sally said about responding. I think there's a slight distinction that we've glossed over between personal attacks on reporters that I'm really not sure what to do with, and really just factual misinformation about what we've reported. Because most people are getting their news online and most people are often getting it through search, if we don't put out the response that Sally's talked about, when you do a search, all that will come up, because the algorithm gives you what you're accustomed to searching, all that will come up is the misinformation or disinformation. So the huge value of that is hopefully when somebody plugs something into the search engine and it pops up, our story that sets the record straight will at least be presented to them so they have the option to see it. It's a very important step.
Yeah, Zaffar, I was about to go to you because Pakistan is a place where distribution and reach is so, there are all of these political factions. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Azmat, we are unfortunately mixing two very different situations. One is an ongoing war where propaganda is a very common thing. I mean, it happens by both the sides. You have to analyze which one to believe in. Once the war stops, you start analyzing it more and the truth starts to come out. But that's the other story, is where in many countries, authoritarian countries, countries where rulers are aspiring to be authoritarian, and where a systematic campaign is going on to discredit journalism taking place in their own country. And that is a very different kind of challenge. And that is where actually good journalism is being destroyed, or a whole campaign is going on to destroy. Now, take the example of Pakistan. Over a period of time, when there was complete censorship, people knew there was complete censorship. When we struggled and we gained a certain level of freedom, then this whole game started how to discredit good journalism. When there was censorship, we used to take newspaper to the censor office. They used to pull out stories. We used to come back, and people were aware of that what is being published is not the whole truth. But now, with this kind of campaign, that whatever investigative story you do to expose a certain politician or some mafia leader, and a campaign starts that this newspaper is read by corrupt journalists, it's to discredit it, that becomes challenging. In our country, for instance, there are various streams of influencers, from government rulers to security establishment people to big industrialists, who have their own interest in trying to discredit this kind of journalism. They manage or control certain television networks. They manage to control part of print media, and of course, a large section of social media. But now, at the moment, in a new situation, they are in trouble because they created these trolls, and with the changing political atmosphere over there, part of them have moved to one political stream, and part are supporting, say, the security establishment over there. And for the first time, even Pakistan's security agencies are not sure how to deal with the situation. The trolls that they created, or half of them, are now attacking them because the people that they had created have run out of favor with them. They are targeting them. So I don't know what's going to happen, whether it will lead to more fascism in the country or complete anarchy. Or maybe tomorrow something good will come out of it, but at the moment I'm not so sure.
This look at reach and distribution and where this is materializing from and how do you penetrate it, sometimes it can be kind of obvious when there are certain political parties involved, when it's very overt what might be motivating it. But I'm very curious about not just when you don't know necessarily who's behind it and what their intentions are. But when you can't even reach into those spaces, and just as an example, I was embedded with a Shia militia in Iraq, and this commander said something to me like, "Can you believe what Obama said about Syria?" And I was like, "What did he say about Syria?" And he goes, "He said that he's going to build every bombed Syrian a house." And I was like, "Show me." And he's like, he plays a video, and the video is Obama speaking, he tears up, and the text below is literally Obama saying, and this is text in Arabic saying, "I'm so sorry for all of the people that I've bombed. I regret it every day." He like wipes a tear from his eye. "I'm going to build a house for every single person that we've bombed." And sometimes I get so sad, I just want to throw myself off the Tower of Chicago. And the video, as you might imagine, they had to make the word Chicago work, was President Obama talking about the Newtown tragedy and talking about gun violence and saying it happens every day on the streets of Chicago. And this video was circulating through WhatsApp groups and through these different commanders who don't, their internet in some parts of the world is just WhatsApp and Facebook and your phone. It's not, they don't know how to, many people don't have Google. They just have these means of communication. It's in the internet packages they buy. And so they're in these groups, and that's where they get what's sent to them. Like, how on earth, like I can tell him, "Oh, by the way, he's speaking English. You can hear him here, and here's what he's actually saying." But at this point, it's too far. Like, how do you reach these spaces and places? And what role do you have in terms of thinking about, structures and systems and how we expand that reach? Should we even be in these kinds of like shady WhatsApp groups? How would you reach them? I'm not sure that we have an answer. It feels like it's so much bigger than just our industry. It involves regulation. It involves things that sometimes I think journalists, it's not our ethos to want to get involved in, to want to lobby for particular kinds of changes. Can you just briefly, anyone who wants to respond to this, jump in? Like, how much bigger is it than our own industry? And who would we have to work with, do you think, to have a real kind of conversation to make this a little bit more possible?
Like, what I think, I just want us to realize that what we are dealing with here is not just some random individuals doing things, attacking journalists. We are talking about systemic. Every political party has its own troll these days in my country. Every political party. Yeah. Every politician has his own troll. So once you do a story critical of that politician, those troll, some of them fake accounts on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, they just go after you intensely. So the ministers have their own trolls. The governors have their own trolls. Sometimes we know them. We know, and these are fully funded projects. So they orchestrate these attacks. Most times you are helpless. And when they start, for instance, if you do a story, even if it is 100% correct, immediately the story is published, they go to leave comments that are negative. Before 5 minutes, they have dominated the comment section. In the next 10 minutes, they have more than 50 or 100 tweets discrediting the story. So we are not, so who do you work with when every politician has his or her own troll? When the man in parliament does the same thing that the governor does. So it's much more complicated, and I don't know who, it seems a very helpless situation, but I'm sure people in the room might have some.
I know, I wanted to do that too, but I think because we started late, I
Yeah.
was told that we would keep the conversation
Yeah.
amongst ourselves for now, but maybe just some closing thoughts from each of you, I would be grateful.
I mean, I think your question is absolutely the right question. The thing that is extraordinary about the example that you used is that you could go to places in the United States and you would find exactly the same thing. Okay, different, right? Different, it's not in Arabic, but totally the same thing, where there is information and there are sources of information and there are stories that we just are completely oblivious to, which is bad, which is very bad. Okay. So I think what I would say is, I don't think we should report on ourselves. I didn't mean that. I think that disinformation is the problem of our generation. I mean, so is climate change, but disinformation is the problem of our generation, because I mean, remember, like, it wasn't that long ago when technologists were like, they were utopians, like technology is going to solve all the world's problems. I literally remember this guy saying this like no more than 15 years ago. It turns out, I mean, so we sit here and we're not even thinking about deep fakes. I mean, you know, AI, like how close are deep fakes? They are really, really close, right? If you talk to the most knowledgeable people in the world, they're saying like, it's, you're not ready. It's going to happen sooner than you think. It's already happening. They're already pretty good. I mean, how soon until we publish, you know, I hope this never happens, but the risk that I face every day that we publish, you know, a photo of a composite person who's not a real person. I mean, like, it's going to get into the stream. We have to teach people how to protect against it. We have to be strong. We have to be, you know, I mean, we're going to give up. I don't think we're going to give up, but it's really, really hard. Okay. And we need to be honest about that. I think disinformation is the story of our, whatever, you know, our century. And we as journalists have got to expose it, because government's behind. I mean, government's behind. Like, first we have to like do it, you know, like figure out what's out there and tell those stories. This isn't an optimistic message, but I think it's an empowering message, because I don't see anybody else doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Zaffar, you have your.
I think we are living in parallel worlds at the moment. We journalists think we are doing a great job, but all these vested interest groups have created their own streams of information or disinformation, and their supporters believe in that. You talked about one doctored videos. Take any group, Shia militant groups, Sunni militant group, Afghan militant group, or Pakistani militant, or even political groups. They have got their own streams of what they believe is real information. You go and try and talk to them and say, what do you know about this? Look at this video, look at this story. And they are convinced that what they are getting on their platform, whether it's WhatsApp or something else, is the real news. It's their own world. And I don't know what to do about it. We may continue to do our journalism and believe in it, but they are not interested in it anymore.
I was just sitting here recalling when I was a child growing up in the Bronx, there was this rumor going around that the symbol for Procter & Gamble meant that it was an occult-owned company or something like that. And they were actually forced, because of the rumor, to change their symbol. When I got to the Middle East, for the Los Angeles Times, Simon Lee, one of the first stories that I did was there was this rumor spreading out of Saudi Arabia. I think it was actually spread by the Grand Imam, right? Is that what you would call him? Anyway, it's been a long time, but that
Ayatollah maybe? Or
no, it was from Saudi. It was from Saudi, and it was that Pokemon is a suspiciously Jewish game and that it promotes theories of evolution. I remember writing about it. There was another instance where actually Sally and I met when we were both based in Egypt. I lived there for 8 years, and I had a very good Egyptian friend. And one day we were talking about the Holocaust. My family was wiped out on my mother's side in the Holocaust. And he looked at me and he said, "You buy that bit about the Holocaust?" And I remember saying, "Hey, we can't talk about the Holocaust." You know, over and over, you would hear people say, Osama bin Laden couldn't have done it. They just couldn't have done it. You know, no way these guys in a cave. The difference now is never in the history of information have so many people been able to distribute disinformation so widely and so effectively. And that's the challenge that we face. Right? It's not what we're talking about isn't new. It's the distribution system that's new. And I don't think there's any taming it. So I think journalists need to continue to do good journalism. We need to question all of our cherished beliefs from the way we used to do it and do it differently with responses like Sally suggested online and the visual journalism that you're talking about. I really think at the end of the day, it's going to come down, whether it's in Pakistan, where the obstacles are significantly harder, or Nigeria, where you also have great challenges, or in Chicago to education.
Olga.
Yeah, I was trying to come up with a good answer. I was thinking back to think they kind of first of all great points, and I just think that the solution, if there is, I mean, there must be a solution. I'm an optimist to disinformation. Is I think there are like three main components to that. One, as was said, is just doing a really good job as journalists and covering disinformation as a story. Second is making sure that we penetrate the bubbles with the help of technology and making technology our friend, not our enemy. You mentioned WhatsApp groups. The main platform where information is spread about the war in Ukraine is not Facebook, Twitter, it's Telegram Messenger. And Telegram has channels, and channels are anonymous. You can't know who is behind the channel. You know, the channel can have a name, can have 100,000 followers, and you will have no idea who is behind it. And they're disseminating and distributing information, and they make their way into even into traditional media. Like traditional media would report that something happened, citing a Telegram channel. And that's, but Telegram channel is just means of, it's a medium, it's how it was brought to you. It's the same thing as picking up New York Times and saying that, you know, this was reported by this piece of paper. And that's, but it's ridiculous how this is, it's making its way into our minds, and we're treating, you know, anonymous platforms as sources of information. And the third component, I think, is somewhere in people's psychology and understanding what, you know, I'm in a group chat of the apartment building that I live in. So it's like it's a house place. It's 100 people in a group chat that are sharing, mostly talking about, you know, when the something is going to be fixed in the building, but also every now and then somebody is trying to share the news that they think is not being shared, and so it's a piece of disinformation about something happening or about to happen, a warning of some kind, something the government is not telling you, etc. And always when I see it, I think there is a huge temptation to dismiss and be arrogant about people buying into, especially the most ridiculous examples of disinformation. But I always try to think that, like, what motivated the person to share that? What made them do it? What made them? They saw this and they wanted to bring it to this little community that they are part of. And I think it's, you know, not being arrogant and not dismissing it, and thinking about how to make these people want to share the truth and not disinformation. I think that's the third component. I just want to add that my one big fear about this is that in several years from now, we're going to find ourselves in the world where we accept that there is no truth, that it can't be, the bubbles can't be penetrated, it's hopeless, and we're in a place of despair and we just give up. And I think it's closer than we may think it is. And that's, one thing, one variant, one option of a future that we should work to not end up in.
Well, I am so grateful to each of you who's brought such a wealth of information, of cultural context, of the experiences that you've seen and had. Thank you for being so candid. I'm also so excited that we're going to be having a reception shortly. We're going to be able to talk more. And yeah, I'm very grateful to Simon Lee and IPI for putting this event together. Let's please give everyone here on the stage a round of applause.